Hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to True Crime Wednesday. I'm Lori Hellis, your host. I'm a retired criminal attorney who's written a book about the Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell story. I moved to Boise in order to be in Idaho during the trials and have been attending the Chad Daybell trial, attended almost every day of Lori's trial, have been attending Chad's trial, although less regularly because it's being live streamed. But I am attending and do plan to attend probably more regularly once the defense takes over. So, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us. We have a lot to talk about tonight. It has been a full week, even though they took Wednesday off, or Tuesday off, sorry, from the trial, the Daybell trial. It has been a full week of testimony. We have a lot to talk about, a lot to digest. And we also have some developments. The Karen Reed trial is also going on. So if you're following that trial, there are a few things that I'd like to talk about in that case, although I have not had the opportunity to follow it as closely because I've been following the Daybell trial. But I am going to try and get caught up over the weekend on the Reed trial, and I do want to talk about that one as well. So there is so much to talk about on the Daybell trial, and I wanted to start out by talking a bit about a few of the questions that I've gotten that I wanted to field first before we really got into the deep details of this week's testimony on the trial. I wanted to point out for anybody who might be new to our channel, please like, subscribe, and join us. Hit that little bell and get notifications. Or as Gigi at Pretty Lies said, you can ring my bell. And please join us. I want to point out that in our show notes, you will find a link to our website. And over the life of the case, now I have to admit that I have not been publishing a great many newsletters recently because I have been up to my elbows and my eyebrows writing the book. The bulk of the book is finished. I'm doing some updates right now based on Chad's trial, but it is being typeset as we speak and will go to the printer for its first printing the 1st of June. So I'm really excited about it, and I'm very proud of it. So hope that if you haven't pre-ordered, that you'll consider doing that. I have a great group of folks who are on the book launch team. They are folks who've signed up and committed to read the book early, post reviews, and post on social media. And in return, I'm giving out a PDF copy, early PDF copy that'll come to those folks in June. That team is full, and I want to thank everybody who took the time to pre-order the book and to join the group. I do want to say my publisher is very pleased with how pre-order sales have been going. Since this is only my second book, the first one came out during COVID and didn't really have a pre-order period. So this is my first experience with pre-orders, but publisher seems to be pretty happy about it so far. So thank you all for that. The reason I bring up the website, even though I have not been posting a huge amount of written newsletters recently, there is a very large archive of newsletters that have to do with legal issues in the case, that have to do with all of the different personalities in the case. So if you are just joining us, or just really getting interested in the case for the first time, there are a couple of resources. You will find them in our show notes as well. You can read through my newsletters that are in the archive, and you can also check out Gigi McKelvey at Pretty Lies and Alibis. She did a series, a deep dive series on the Daybell case. So if you are just getting up to speed on it, that's a couple of places that you might want to go. There are a couple of other announcements, kind of general announcements, that I wanted to make before we dive into the case. Somebody sent me an email during the trial, both Lori's and Chad's trial. When Melanie Gibb testified, she admitted that she and David Warwick had been married for about 3 years, but they haven't lived together. They have only lived together about 9 or 10 months of those years that they've been married. She lives in Arizona, he lives in Utah. Well, a sharp-eyed follower sent me a note and told me that in August of 2023, so last year, David Warwick actually filed for divorce, and about a month later filed to dismiss the divorce. We don't know what that's all about, but it is interesting because John Pryor asked them whether or not they had gotten married so that they wouldn't have to testify against one another. Now, neither one of them have been charged or even accused of crimes, but it is sort of interesting to think about. A couple of other things that little tidbits of it come up recently. We all saw Colby come to court and testify. When Colby testified, we didn't see the Lori Vallow Colby jail recording. There's a reason for that. This trial is about Chad, not about Lori, and so it made sense. I don't think the prosecution would have gotten past a relevance objection in that case, because this case is about Chad and not about Lori. So they didn't play that, but Colby did testify about his relationship with Charles, called him his dad. Did testify about the fact that Lori lied repeatedly to him, and he was as much in the dark as anybody else was. And a lot of people have been wondering how Colby is doing. I think he and his wife Kelsey went through a real rough patch. We know that law enforcement was involved in an incident involving the two of them. And a lot of folks have been wondering about how they were doing. Well, last week, Colby, for the first time in a very long time, right after his testimony in the trial, put out a YouTube video and said that he is returning to doing YouTube videos, and was very excited to announce that he and Kelsey are expecting a baby boy. So that is their third child. They have 2 little girls, and baby number 3 is on the way. So that was very exciting to hear. And I'm really happy for Colby that he and his family appear to be doing well. One last thing, one of our avid followers, and a person who I've gotten to be good friends with since I met her, because she lives here in Boise. Her name is Jane, and she unfortunately is just having a rough time right now. Her husband, her darling husband, is having a real struggle with some health problems. So I just want to send lots of love and healing vibes out for Jane and her husband, Bruce. Anybody else need a little extra? Please post it in the comments so that we can send you good vibes, prayers, hugs for whatever else is going on. Because, we're all in this together. I love the little phrase that says, when push comes to shove, we're all just walking each other home. So if you got something you'd like to share with us, drop it in the chat. Be sure that and let Jen know so that she can also share it with everybody else. So send some good thoughts and good vibes and good prayers and jujus out to anybody who's on the rough side today, and especially to Jane and Bruce. I had a question about the LDS connection with the folks who were involved in this trial. I don't have a full inventory of everyone who is a church member, but what I can tell you is that within Fremont and Madison counties, which is where Rexburg is in Madison County, and Fremont County, which is the neighboring county to Madison County, and where Chad Daybell's property was located. Within those two counties, there we go. Hi, Carol. Within those two counties, somewhere around 96% of the population are members of the LDS Church. The city of Rexburg was actually founded by leaders that were sent from Salt Lake in the 1800s to found the city of Rexburg. So Rexburg has a long history of LDS membership. There's an LDS temple in Rexburg, and of course, BYU, Idaho, the extension campus of BYU is located there. So what I can tell you is, to the best of my knowledge, at the time that the case originally came to light, Madison County Prosecutor Rob Wood was the bishop in his ward. We know that Judge Boyce is also a church member. I've heard rumors that he is not so regularly attending services in Rexburg, but I've also heard rumors that he is attending church in Idaho Falls. I don't think that's particularly unusual for people who are in the public eye, even when they're not hearing high visibility cases. Judges usually attempt not to mix their personal life and their professional life. And oftentimes that means going a little further afield to participate in church and other sorts of activities. I mean, I know of judges that go to the next town if they want to play softball or soccer on a team or any of those things, just so that they're specifically not participating in community activities with community members that might appear in front of them. So not surprising that Judge Boyce may not be regularly attending church services in Rexburg. As far as I know, Lindsay Blake is also a church member. As far as the other attorneys, I know that Rachel Smith was not a church member, and I know for certain that John Pryor is not. But I think you have the double dynamic of not only are they members of this sort of faith that is as much a culture as it is a religion, but they're also living in a very small town in a fairly kind of in a bubble. So those are some considerations that made me happy that the trial was moved out of Rexburg, even though they remain church members. I think there's less opportunity for pressure, less opportunity for good old boy kind of networking because they're here in Ada County in the Boise area. That's where I am right now. Thank you, by the way, talking about me being in Boise, for all those folks that have been sending us good wishes. We've accepted an offer on our house here in Boise, and we signed the closing papers today on our Oregon house. So we're very excited about that. Our daughter is still traveling right now for work and hoping really soon that they'll be able to find a house in Bend as well. So we're very excited about those big changes coming up. I expect we will be moving in early July. So there's just a couple of other like minor little things that I wanted to point out. Somebody asked about the sort of coincidence of the number of people who have had pulmonary embolisms. And one of our followers in particular asked about a toxin called I know I'm gonna butcher this, tetrodotoxin. It's also called TTX. It is found in a couple of venomous sea creatures, including blue-ringed octopus and pufferfish, both of which are very commonly known in Kauai and in Hawaii. And one of the effects of being poisoned with that toxin is that it causes pulmonary embolisms. Somebody also asked me about Eldon Clausen, Chad's neighbor. So I did want to sort of touch on that as well, because he also died of a pulmonary embolism within weeks of Tammy. And he was quite a character. I have talked about him before. He was a financial advisor who'd been very successful, had a small cattle operation on his property. And he was also on the irrigation, the water commission, and really took it on his plate, on himself to patrol and keep track of the irrigation system out where they lived. So it was not at all unusual to see him walking up and down the irrigation canals behind people's homes and on other people's property. So we understand that he died about 3 weeks after Tammy Daybell of a pulmonary embolism. Now, his family absolutely categorically denies that that his death had any connection to Chad or Tammy Daybell. But we do know that Eldon's wife was very interested in Chad's teachings and actually had spent some time at Chad's house listening to some of his presentations about his teachings. So there are some connections there, even though his family has said absolutely he was not, his death was not at all related to Chad and Tammy. I noticed that Lindsay Blake sounds a little stuffy today. You can hear I've got a growl still from, I don't know, in Lindsay's case, she's got a young child, so you know they tend to bring stuff home, and I know that the court staff and the lawyers have been trying to go home to Rexburg on weekends. I don't know for her whether it's allergies or whether she's got a cold, but she's a real trooper. And I do want to say she's been on fire this last week. So really, we'll get into talking about her direct examination and how she's been doing. The last thing I wanted to bring up is the fact that Matt Daybell has been in the courtroom. Matt Daybell is Chad's younger brother. Sorry, Chad's the oldest. Matt is his brother, married to Heather. Heather has been quite outspoken and has also done a lengthy interview on hidden true crimes. So my understanding is that Heather is not in court because John Pryor has her under subpoena, and so according to the court's order, the sequestration order, she cannot be in the courtroom or view any of the online streamed testimony. And but I thought it was interesting that Matt Daybell made the statement that he was there in court today and again tomorrow to support Larry and Kay. He was not there in support of his brother, Chad. Now let's dive into some of the testimony. I wanted to go back to Brenda Dye. Now, she testified last Wednesday. And we did talk a bit about her testimony last week, but I do want to continue to talk a little bit about her. Mostly because we heard today from Eric Christensen, Dr. Eric Christensen, who was the medical examiner and doctor of pathology who performed Tammy Daybell's autopsy. So just sort of circling back to connect up some of those dots, I thought we'd go back and talk a little bit about Brenda Dye. Now, as Dr. Christensen pointed out in his testimony today, Idaho has this funny sort of hybrid system. Some states have a coroner system, and the coroner is elected. And the coroner doesn't necessarily have to have any medical experience. However, most have some medical experience. Brenda Dye, for example, is an EMT. She works for the local emergency and ambulance system, and she has been through coroner training. But she is the elected coroner in Fremont County. Now remember, Fremont County is a small county. We're talking 13,000 people. So it's a pretty small group, and being the coroner isn't a hugely demanding job. What the coroner does is the coroner determines the cause of death and signs off on the death certificate. But as Dr. Christensen pointed out, under state law, the cause of death is limited to 5 different potential causes of death. So let me see if I can remember them. Natural causes, accidental, homicide, suicide, or undetermined. I think that's the 5. He then talked about the fact that the coroner will do an investigation. John Pryor made a point of pointing out the Idaho statute and asking Brenda Dye, did you start an inquest? Did you follow the steps that are in the statute? But in general, what happens is that the coroner is going to follow the lead of the law enforcement folks who are actually doing the investigation. And in most cases, that's sufficient. So one of the things that Brenda Dye said, which is important because it's something that Dr. Christensen couldn't have known because he did an autopsy on Tammy's body several months after she had been embalmed and buried and then exhumed. So the things that were important that Brenda Dye observed were that there was very clear lividity now in Tammy's body. Now, lividity is when the heart stops circulating blood, then the blood begins, gravity takes over, and the blood begins to pool in the lowest points of the body. So, for example, if a person is lying on a hard surface, the places where you would expect to see lividity would be across the shoulder blades, where the body's making contact with the surface, across the buttocks, and maybe not so much in the arch of the back or because the blood's going to run to the lowest point in the body. So generally you'll see it across the calves, the backs of the thighs, if a person's lying on their back. So Brenda Dye observed that there was very clear lividity that had accumulated in Tammy's body. Now, the other thing that Dr. Christensen said about lividity is that for some period after a body is, after the heart stops pumping, there will be a period when the if the body is shifted or moved, it could impact how the lividity appears. So, for example, a body that it comes to rest on its back, if the body is turned up on its side, then of course the lividity is going to occur along the side of the body. But there is a point at which that lividity isn't mobile anymore. And no matter how much you move the body, that lividity is not going to change. So one of the things that the observation was that after about 4 hours, that lividity no longer is going to move along with the body. The other thing that Brenda Dye, the three things that you look for in order to try and determine how long someone has been deceased is lividity, rigor mortis, and body temperature. So the next thing that they looked at was rigor mortis. Now, what occurs, and Dr. Christensen once again explained this today in his testimony, when the as a body when the heart stops and the body dies, the muscles become very stiff, and that usually occurs somewhere around 2 hours in. Then somewhere between 8 and 12 hours, and the way that Dr. Christensen explained it is, it's the point at which decomposition begins. The body is no longer alive, blood's no longer circulating, all of the important things that circulate in the body are no longer moving around, and the body begins to decompose. And that process starts to happen after about 8 to 12 hours. That's when the rigor mortis relaxes. So that's a good indication for somebody who's trying to figure out perhaps time of death. If the body is still stiff, then you know that it's sometime within that 2 to 12-hour window. The other thing that they look at is the temperature of the body when it's discovered. So for Brenda Dye, of course, Dr. Christensen wouldn't have any idea of this except for the information he got from Brenda Dye. When Brenda Dye arrived, she touched the body, felt it, and both she and Dr. Christensen remarked that the last place that holds heat in the body is the abdomen. And so that's the place that you touch to see whether or not the body is cold or warm. Brenda Dye observed that the body was very clearly, the abdomen was cold to the touch. Chad Daybell said she was cold to the touch. And that's an indication that the body has been has been dead for several hours in order to get to the point where there's no residual heat left in the body. Now, the odd thing about this is Chad Daybell, and this comes up again, again and again in our, there are a couple things that are going to come up several different times here. What Chad Daybell said in at least one version of his story, and we're going to talk about how many different versions there are, that Tammy was going through menopause and she slept warm, and so she often slept with her feet outside the covers. Then Chad said he found her with her feet still in the bed and her head off the bed, and he called for his son Garth to come and help put her back on the bed. So that got me thinking, if you're sleeping with your feet outside the bed, how do your feet get wrapped up in the sheet? I guess I could understand it if you were sleeping with the rest of your body out and your feet in the sheet. I mean, I suppose it could happen, but it just seems more likely to me that her feet wouldn't get tangled up in the sheets because they were sticking out. So the other thing Chad says, in at least one version, is that he found her at about 2 a.m. and she was already cold. And then, oh, no, I'm sorry. One of his versions, he says that the medical examiner said Tammy had died at about 2 a.m., but that he didn't notice it until she fell out of bed after 5 a.m. How does that happen? Even Brenda Dye was confused about that and asked Chad, and he said, well, maybe what happened is I pulled the covers and she fell out of bed. So, but Brenda Dye was skeptical that somehow Tammy's body after her death had moved. And I think there's a lot of question about that. The other thing was that, and John Pryor has made a big deal about this throughout all of his cross-examination, and that was that Tammy Daybell had a lot of essential oils and natural sorts of treatments for things. The point that I don't think was made firmly enough when the prosecution was examining Brenda Dye was, did anyone identify exactly what Tammy Daybell had taken that night? Yes, there was a cupboard that had a bunch of stuff in it, but anybody who has a bathroom cupboard will have stuff in it that people don't routinely take, whether it's cold medicine or nasal spray or cough medicine or any of those things that you use as needed, but you certainly wouldn't take on a daily basis. So it's a little bit difficult for anyone to say, what did she take that night? That's why I thought, and we know that John Pryor, because we know it from Lori's allocution at her trial, that she claimed that that overdoses from medication happen, and or actually what she said was fatal side effects from medication happen. So, and if you put that together, you know she's talking about Tammy. So you know that Chad and John Pryor are going to go to Tammy died of some natural or not natural, but accidental, not homicide, some accidental mechanism was responsible for her death. Spit it out, Lori. And so I thought that they missed an opportunity with Brenda Dye, who was there and who did talk about all of those naturopathic remedies. They missed an opportunity to say, but you don't know what, if any, of those things she actually took that night. Now, the toxicology reports only report that she had fluoxetine, which is Prozac, in her system. And the only other thing that it showed, according to Dr. Christensen, was a somewhat elevated but within normal range of selenium, which is a heavy metal. So, and I will say that those heavy metal sorts of within acceptable levels can vary depending on the region of the country you live in and what your water source is. And I do believe that their water source was, for drinking water, was a well. So, and you know, wells are have to be tested and all of those things. However, water sources like wells can vary in the amount of heavy metals that are in them, even if it is within the accepted level. So it could very well be that the whole family has elevated selenium numbers. Sorry, I'm trying to deal with the raspy voice here, and I'm not being very successful about it. So one of the things that I want to talk about as we go along, and I'm going to sort of hold it till a little bit later, because there are other witnesses who become important, is the fact that Chad Daybell told several different versions of what caused Tammy's death, and how it happened, when it happened. His timeline is all over. I mean, he definitely was sort of making it up as he went along. So, and that's important to remember. Now, over the few days of testimony, we have heard from at least 4 of Tammy's coworkers, her fellow teachers at the elementary school. Each one of them came in and said Tammy was very active. She walked all over the school. She didn't have any trouble. She wasn't out of breath. She was right on top of taking care of her students when they came to the library. And they were all people who either took the clogging class with her, or were in this high intensity fitness class. Now, we heard that it originally started out as a Zumba class, and that it sort of morphed into a more challenging, although Zumba is pretty challenging, a more challenging high intensity fitness class. The other thing that, I'll bring that up when we talk about Dr. Christensen. So, we had Detective Mattingly on the stand. He was the detective who was there the night that Tammy Daybell died. I didn't really note that there was a lot of new information that came from him. A lot of it was a repeat of what Brenda Dye had already said about the demeanor of the family, how they behaved, some of those things. But I did think that it was very interesting that Detective Mattingly said that when the results of Tammy's autopsy came back and they had the report. Now, you may recall that the court sealed that report, so we didn't know what was in it, but the police had it. And we knew that they had given that information to Tammy's children, because Tammy's children were on a Dateline or 48 Hours interview a couple of years ago, where they talked about the fact that their mother's cause of death was asphyxiation. So, but I thought it was interesting that Detective Mattingly said that he tried to go and talk to Emma about the results of the autopsy, and that she declined to talk to him and didn't want to hear about the results of the autopsy. So I thought that was kind of an interest, an interesting, to keep using that word, um, that was an kind of important fact. You'll hear as we go along that Emma seems to be the person who is the most. This isn't a surprise for anybody who saw the interview with Chad's kids and saw Emma tromping around in the backyard, walking across the graves of Tylee and JJ as if they weren't even there. It's pretty clear which camp she's in, but she's very clearly and adamantly believes that her father is innocent and has been railroaded. And I mean, I cannot fault the Daybell kids either way. Whatever they're feeling, they're entitled to. I cannot imagine these folks have lost their mother, who they was very devoted and much beloved. They've now lost their father. It's also been clear from the very beginning that Emma has some sort of a relationship with Lori Vallow. She remarked when we saw the interview or the body cam footage of Chad in the back of the police vehicle, Emma remarked that she already had her own Telmate account because she had been talking to Lori in jail. And so there's no question that she's approached this from a very different perspective, I'll say. We heard again from Officer Kayakamanu. I must say, I find it really annoying that John Pryor doesn't make any effort to pronounce Officer Kayakamanu's name properly. I think it's disrespectful. And it's just one of those little like pet peeves for me. I think that you should respect people's names. When I was growing up, my grandmother said to me, never scrawl your signature so it can't be read. That's your name and you need to treat it like you're proud of it. So I guess I just have a connection to names, but it bothers me that he has a South Pacific Islander name. It's not very really difficult to pronounce because it's pronounced phonetically. South Island names they pronounce every vowel. So for him, it is Kayakamanu. And it is annoying to me that he's not respectful. I was just wanted to be sure that this was stuff I'm not repeating here. One of the things that he brought out was that in looking over Tammy Daybell's email inbox, it appears that Tammy and their children also ascribed and had knowledge of Chad's light and dark evaluations. One of the things that she says is when they're trying to do a Zoom call with Mark, because he was on his mission in South Africa, they were trying to do a video call with him and his camera wouldn't work. And her comment in her email was because his camera was cursed, but Dad removed the curse. Mark asked if there was anything notable was found in him when he was body coded. Body coding seems to be a form of it, like the emotion code, which is fairly common belief in LDS practice. It's about energy in the body. And so Mark sends her an email and says, was there anything notable found in him when he was body coded? We're not 100% clear what that means, but Tammy's answer is very enlightening. She says, you had a lot of weapons, negative conditions, and curses, plus trapped emotions. We cleared out quite a bit. We'll do that more regularly for you. So there's an indication in that email that Tammy had some level of belief, the same as Chad, that they could clear out negative emotions, that they could clear out weapons and negative conditions, and that is telling, because that's the first time we've heard that Tammy really bought into this same ideology that Chad was teaching. There also is a comment, Mom and I think this was from, this was Emma's email. And it says, Mom and I taught 12-year-old Sunday school yesterday. Canyon Scott's actions confirmed he is a 4.2 dark. It was interesting that I thought it was interesting that John Pryor asked, is Canyon Scott dead now? Which he's not. But Chad Daybell's answer and response was, I will enjoy watching his growth, talking about Canyon Scott again, to world terror and domination. So these are emails that were being exchanged between Tammy, Mark, Emma, and Chad. And it's very clear in those emails that they understood the light and dark premises and were also believers. So that's the first time we've seen that information. There are emails from Julie Rowe to Tammy Daybell, including an email where Julie Rowe says she had just met with her state president and he asked them to stop publishing Julie Rowe's books. She said, she told them, the state president, she didn't have the rights. And Julie Rowe asked her to contact the Daybells and ask that they stop publishing the books. Now, you probably recall that that Julie Rowe was excommunicated, and the best I can tell, it happened shortly after that. It was also interesting that at one point it had been suggested, Chad suggested, that Tammy Daybell had hurt her wrist a few months before she died because she fainted. But the emails to Mark are very clear that she hurt her wrist because she tripped over a duck gate, whatever that is, and some kind of a gate to keep the ducks in the yard, and fell and hurt her wrist. There also was an email about raccoons, which may very well have been where Chad got the idea for the raccoon email that he sent the day that Tylee's body was buried. Tammy sent Mark an email and said, last year it was skunks, this year it is a raccoon. It's raccoons. We thought the neighbor cats, or the feral cats, were eating all the cat food, and we discovered that it was a raccoon. And it was a very big, fat raccoon, Garth discovered it and kept an eye on it. They chased it up a tree, and Chad shot it. And Tammy said it was buried in their compost pile because it was eating the cat food. Now, first of all, they said they tried to trap it. They borrowed a trap from somebody else, and the trap was way too small because the raccoon was huge. The second thing is that this occurred at night because raccoons are nocturnal. And then Tammy sent him, they got a bigger trap, and Tammy sent him a picture of a smaller raccoon in a trap. So there were at least 2 instances where raccoons were talked about. One was shot and killed out of a tree. So later, Chad then sent Tammy a text saying that while he saw a raccoon walking along the back fence and shot it, and he had buried it in their pet cemetery. That was clearly an effort to explain why the yard had been dug up in the area of the pet cemetery on the day that Tylee's remains were buried. So that was sort of a gee whiz moment, I guess. Now, one of what I thought was one of the most persuasive, compelling witnesses was Steve Schultz. So Steve Schultz first met, Steve Schultz had known the Daybell family in Springville, Utah, his whole life. He grew up in the same neighborhood as the Daybell family, knew the Daybell kids, and grew up within the same, not ward, but probably stake. About 12 years ago, he changed careers. About 12 years before Tammy's death, he had changed careers, and he had become a mortician and was a funeral director at the funeral home in Springville. Now, this is also where Chad was a cemetery sexton for the Evergreen Cemetery, which is where Tammy is now buried. So after Tammy died, the morning that Tammy died, several things happened in very quick succession. The local mortuary in Rexburg picked up Tammy's body and immediately embalmed her. Chad then reached out to Steve Schultz, who was the funeral director at the mortuary in Springville, and asked him if he would coordinate Tammy's funeral in Springville. Now, Springville is about a 4 or 5 hour drive from Rexburg. Tammy was found dead on a Saturday morning. So Steve Schultz reached out to, now, one of the things Steve Schultz testified to was that he's known the whole Daybell family. He also knew Tammy's family. And he also lived up the street and was neighbors with Chad and Tammy in Springville for several years. They were neighbors until Tammy and Chad moved to Rexburg. So, and he considered them good friends. So, of course, when Chad called him to ask for his help in arranging Tammy's service, he said absolutely he would be there as soon as he could. He called Samantha Gwillem's husband, Jason, I believe is his first name, and asked Jason if he wanted to drive with him from Springville to Rexburg to pick Tammy up. Jason said absolutely that he wanted to go with him, so the two men drove into Rexburg. Steve took all of the information that he needed with him so that the family could pick out a casket and do all the concrete enclosure and all of those things. And so he sat down with Chad. Now, this is on Sunday. And Chad says to him, I want the funeral tomorrow, Monday. So Steve says, Chad, I don't think we can get this all pulled together by Monday because we have to, there has to be time today, Sunday. None of the offices are open. I can't get a death certificate. We can't, that's moving too fast. Well, and all Chad could say was, I don't want to drag this out. I just want to get it over with. So Steve and he come to an agreement that they will have Tammy's viewing on Monday and her funeral on Tuesday morning. So Steve then leaves. He and Jason go to the Rexburg mortuary and pick up Tammy, who'd already been embalmed, and they transport her to Springville on Sunday. And by that time, it's Sunday evening. He does say that he looked over Tammy's body and didn't see anything that was overtly suspicious at that point. But he did look over at Jason on the ride back. Now, Jason is Tammy Daybell's brother-in-law, and say, do you think he killed her? Because everything was so, everything that Chad was doing and saying was sending up red flags for Steve. So they took her body back. One of the things Steve said was he had to, they don't keep caskets on hand, they have them delivered, and he had to have the casket they picked out delivered, and that had to come in on Monday if they were going to have her funeral on Tuesday. So they had her viewing, and there are witnesses who are coming up who talk about the viewing, and she was buried in the Springville Cemetery, where she took her engagement photos with Chad years before, on that Tuesday morning. So by that evening, the entire Daybell family was already back in Rexburg. Now, we're going to talk about Richard Garner, because Richard Garner was one of the next witnesses. And I'm going to kind of skip around a little bit because I do want to pull up, I do want to bring up some things that came up with Richard Garner. So he was the principal of Tammy's school where she worked at Central Elementary, which is a kindergarten through third grade elementary school. He said she was very active. She always went the extra mile. He laughingly talked about the time she set up the computer lab for the kids. And the teachers would take the kids down to the computer lab. And often they would get distracted by their classmates walking by the windows of the computer lab. So she just took it upon herself and made some curtains to cover up the windows when the kids were working in the computer lab. When he reached out to Chad and wanted to know when the service was going to be. Now, these were Tammy's coworkers who loved her, and from a very small community, small school. And they all wanted to know, what can we do? How can we help? When is the memorial service going to be? And this principal was interested in finding out so that he could actually give his teachers time off so that they could attend the memorial. He wanted to close school early so that parents of students, and faculty, staff could attend her memorial. So when he reached out to Chad, Chad said, we don't have anything planned here. We did it all in Springville. Well, this didn't set well with Richard. And so he asked for permission from Chad to do some sort of a memorial there in Rexburg. Chad's comment was, I don't want to. I don't want to inconvenience anyone. The other thing that was kind of odd was the family didn't really want much involvement in the planning. When he asked Emma to come up with a program for the memorial, she sent it to him and said, "Here you go." Didn't really have much to say about participating, helping, doing any of those things. Now, grief impacts people differently, and that may very well have been meant nothing, but it was of note and it came out in testimony. So Richard Garner and his wife ultimately ended up arranging for Tammy's memorial on that Wednesday, and on that Wednesday gave the closed school so that the students and their parents and faculty could attend Tammy's memorial. The ladies of the church, of course, did the luncheon and everybody participated. Um, and the interesting thing to remember is that the day of Tammy's service, Lori Vallow was searching online for beach wedding dresses, and they had already ordered their malachite and silver rings. That happened before Tammy died, and and that afternoon, after the memorial service, Chad took his 5 kids, or 4, because Mark didn't make it back from his mission in time for his mother's funeral. But the 4 children over to Lori's for cookies after the memorial service. So that last witness on Friday was Ron Arnold, and he's a realtor. And this was the point where things got a little spicy, and the point where I think there was some concern about what the jury had heard. I want to just briefly talk about what a mistrial is. So a mistrial only occurs after a jury has been seated, and it occurs only if there is some sort of misconduct that leads to the jury, whether it's purposeful or accidental, that leads to the jury hearing something that would be inadmissible. So what came up was the prosecution called Ron Arnold, and they wanted to talk about Chad's real estate to begin with. They wanted to talk about him showing the 80 acres or whatever it was to David Warwick that morning. And John Pryor went on at length about that Chad was still in his church clothes. I don't know why that matters, although we might figure that out when he starts calling witnesses. But he talks about showing that property to David Warwick the weekend that he and Melanie Gibb were there, which is also the same weekend that JJ was killed. So the next thing that the prosecution wanted to talk about was the fact that after Tammy's death, Chad approached this Ron Arnold and asked him about subdividing his property. Arnold discovered that the property was too small to subdivide because it wouldn't accommodate another septic system, I think. And nonetheless, it could not be subdivided, but it would be possible for them to put another home on the property because it's about 4 acres. But he didn't say the 4 acres part, and that's important later. So they talked about, he said he was going to need a place for he and Lori to live. Apparently, Lori didn't want to live in Tammy's house. Chad had repeatedly said he didn't like being there and sleeping in the house because Tammy had died there. But they were talking about putting up another um, another structure on the property. So Arnold told Chad that the quickest way to do that would be to put a mobile home on the property because it would be much faster than a stick-built house. The prosecution made the point that the timing was suspicious, and that in hindsight, Arnold thought perhaps they were interested in doing some sort of um, uh, foundational work, some sort of site work on the property as a way to disguise the fact that the children had been buried there. The last witness that I wanted to talk about it was Craig Huff. He was friends with Chad and from Springville. And it was interesting because at the viewing, Chad said to Craig Huff, you know, there have been some miracles that have happened surrounding Tammy's death. And one of them is that last week I managed to get all of the passwords and usernames for all of our accounts from Tammy. And made it sound like it was just sort of a serendipitous, miraculous thing that he asked her for all their passwords. Now, it's common knowledge that Tammy was the person who managed the family house finances, that she was the one who ran the publishing business when they had it, and that she was the one who was in charge of all those things. So miraculously, he got all the passwords and users names from her the week before she died, which to me sounds a little bit like consciousness of guilt or intent. So that was Friday, and then we get to Monday. Now, there was no court yesterday, so we only have 2 days of testimony. Probably the most time-consuming and probably tedious for the jury testimony came on Monday from FBI agent Nicholas, sorry, can't read my own writing. Balance is his name. He talked about what rigorous training FBI agents go through before they can be on the cast team. It's actually a couple of years of training that they go through. And what CAST does is it locates devices. Now, he made the point, it doesn't locate people. It cannot tell you what pocket that device is in. It tells you where a particular electronic device was. It does it in a couple of different ways. It does it because it interfaces with Wi-Fi, they interface with cell towers, and they interface with Google location services, so satellite. So the prosecution walked him through the location of the cell phones during the time, around the time that Tylee and JJ were both killed, and the time that they were in Chad's yard. I didn't think there was a lot of new information. In fact, there was no real new information that came from the CAST data. I was actually a little surprised. I was hoping that there would be more information having to do with Chad's phone and where it was, but they really sort of stuck to the location of Chad's phone during those specific dates and times. It was very clear that there was a real flurry of text messages and phone calls back and forth to Lori, back and forth, the 3 ways, Chad to Lori, Lori to Chad, Alex to Chad, Lori to Chad, Alex to Chad, Lori to Alex. Yeah, definitely And there were a lot of phone calls and a lot of text messages flying back and forth during those 2 mornings when the children's bodies were being disposed of. Other than that, we've heard pretty much everything that he had to say about the movements of the telephones, the cell phones, and I did get this question. I made a note because somebody asked me. Um, when John Pryor is asking questions, and this is purely a courtroom strategy, different lawyers do things differently. You will notice that when the law enforcement witnesses come on the stand, they turn around and answer their questions to the jury. That's something they're trained to do. The other thing that is having the other thing that is a little odd is when John Pryor is asking questions of the witnesses, he's turning and facing the jury. I think that's a mistake. I think that it comes off a little arrogant, a little bit. I think that there are times to turn and face the jury and make eye contact with them. But certainly, if you're asking a question of the person who's on the stand, you want to address that question to them. You don't want to address the question to the jury. So I think it looked a little awkward, and I think maybe the jury felt it was a little bit awkward. The other thing that I noticed is that, oh, I forgot the big thing about the realtor. I'm going to go back to that. The thing that I thought was interesting was the first week they were showing their being able to project their laptop screens up onto the big screen behind the witness on the wall. At one point, John Pryor plugged the HDMI cord into his computer and it promptly brought up what appeared to be some notes on his laptop. They were very small, and I'm not sure that anybody could actually read them, but they were taken down immediately. There was a sidebar. The judge came back and gave the jury the instruction that they were to disregard that if they had read it, they were to disregard it. Now, I have no idea what was up there. I couldn't read it. But a lot of folks were a little bit nervous that that could have, had that information been something that would have been too prejudicial for the jurors, it could have been something that could have caused a mistrial. So, but the thing that did freak everybody out was while John Pryor was cross-examining Ron Arnold, who was the realtor, in addition to talking about him coming and showing property to David Warwick, they also talked about Chad's property and about subdividing it. And at one point, John Pryor said to him, well, that's a pretty, and John Pryor keeps trying to make the point that it wasn't, the children weren't buried in Chad's backyard, that they were buried out in the pasture, and that it was someplace that people might not notice. And I'm not really sure the distinction, other than the fact that I think he's going to say somebody snuck in and buried the children, that he didn't know they were there. So maybe that's where he's going with that. So he's talking to the realtor and he's saying, well, this is a good sized property, right? How many acres is it? And the realtor turned around and said, I don't know, Mr. Pryor. You own it. How big is it? Well, yeah, you own it now. How many acres is it? And so John Pryor was pretty taken aback, said, I appreciate that. Your Honor, can we have a sidebar? And they went off to a sidebar. One of the things I really didn't like was when, and I realize that we can't all be in complete control of our expressions sometimes. But when they got up from council table and walked over to do the sidebar, Rob Wood was just laughing and grinning and looking really smug. And I thought his reaction was it was kind of a dick move, if you want to know the truth. And I didn't like it. Lindsay Blake, on the other hand, was pretty deadpan, pretty professional. Now, I have to say that Lindsay Blake has been on fire. She has been doing a great job in this case, and she really is in charge of this prosecution. There is no question in my mind who is driving the prosecution bus. And Lindsay Blake has it going on. So the cast information was long and took up most of the day on Monday. So then we had no court on Tuesday. Actually, there were a couple of other witnesses on Monday afternoon after the cast, and they were interesting witnesses because they called into question Chad Daybell's rendition of what happened to Tammy. And there were several different explanations for what happened to Tammy that Chad Daybell offered to people, particularly at the viewing that they had on Monday before Tammy's funeral, her burial in Springville. So one of them was Hannah Parker Munoz, and she is Tammy Daybell's second cousin. Her mother is Tammy Daybell's cousin. And her mother was testified after she did. So what Hannah said was she arrived at the viewing, and the first time she went through the line for the viewing, she went through with her father, and her father asked Chad, stopped to talk to Chad, and said, "Oh my gosh, how did this happen?" So in his conversation with the cousin's dad or husband, Chad said Tammy had been coughing, she threw up, he was in his office working. Now, there is a whole bunch of discussion about where all these rooms are in this house, and that's going to come up. He told this man he was in his office working. About 10 o'clock, Tammy came in and said she'd thrown up again, but that she was feeling better. Now, that's important. She'd thrown up again because Chad said Tammy'd been sick. She threw up. She came in. She said she'd just thrown up again, but she was feeling better. And she was going to bed. Chad told the cousin-in-law, I guess, when he went to bed at about 1 o'clock, he found Tammy off the bed and cold to the touch. Thank you, this girl. You are so welcome. I have tried very hard to be fair about LDS teaching, but there's absolutely no question that the teachings are a fundamental part of the why in this case. So I appreciate that you're finding my approach to be, I'm trying to be fair, and I have spent a lot of time learning about the LDS faith. So thank you for noticing. So the interesting part about Hannah's testimony is 2 hours later, so he said, I was working in my office. Tammy came in around 10 o'clock, said she'd thrown up again, but she was feeling better and she was going to bed. When I went to bed at 1 a.m., her body was half off the bed and she was cold to the touch. Now, you got to ask yourself where the lividity would be if she's halfway off the bed with her feet still on the bed and her head off the bed. because that doesn't necessarily line up with what Brenda Dye said about the lividity in Tammy's body, or what Dr. Christensen observed, and his testimony is coming up because it was today. So the next thing is that he then 2 hours later, the daughter's, the cousin, whose name is Patty later, Patty comes in. This is Hannah's mom, and she's Tammy's first cousin. And so when the mom comes in, Hannah then goes back through the viewing line again with her mom. And when she gets up to her mom talking to Chad, Chad then tells a completely different story. He says that he went to bed with Tammy after she got sick, and he woke up that morning and she was off the bed and cold. So very different stories. One of the things that she said that she didn't appreciate were some of the remarks that Chad made at Tammy's funeral. We heard that each one of the 4 children, because they didn't wait long enough for Mark to get back from his mission in South Africa. So the 4 children who spoke all spoke very lovingly and fondly of Tammy. When Chad got up, one of the other witnesses said his talk was more like a church talk, and he didn't really speak all that fondly about Tammy. Patty said she felt that Chad said things about Tammy that weren't nice. He said she wasn't easy to live with, and that she was lazy and had depression. So my own thought about that was, well, that's rich. The woman who has single-handedly pretty much been responsible for supporting the family during their entire married life, as well as running his business on the side, is the lazy one in the family. Okie doke. And he said she was depressed. He said the issue of her playing video games came up. Emma told the story that Tammy would sneak pets in, and because she was an animal lover, and Chad was forever telling her she couldn't have any more animals, and she didn't want to get in trouble. And Garth said that he was always Tammy's lookout when she played video games so that he could get her off the computer before his dad got home and she got in trouble. Which sort of tells you a little something about the power dynamics in the Daybell home. So that ended the Monday testimony, most of which was taken up by the testimony about the cast, and the remainder of which was taken up with those 2 family witnesses. I think the prosecution has done a really good job of sort of sandwiching in those witnesses. So you definitely do not want to load the jury up on a bunch of technical witnesses all at once, and you want to sort of sandwich in those more emotional witnesses, more tangible witnesses in between, because you want to sort of keep the attention and the emotion of the jury sort of like this, okay? You don't want there to be any great big valleys of lack of interest. And it often happens when you're talking about this highly technical stuff about like the cast. I mean, you know, your eyes can glaze over pretty quick when you're listening to that sort of data about where this phone was, and he's talking about the such and such phone attributable to Lori Vallow, and the such and such phone attributable to Chad Daybell, and the such and such phone was plus or minus 4 meters within this parameter, and it was off this tower, and then there was this, and I mean, it is hard to stay on top of that. Now, I will say this jury has been extremely attentive. I think the Lori Vallow jury found that kind of testimony a little more difficult than this group has. They have been very attentive, even when it was kind of tedious. So I think the prosecution has done a good job of sort of keeping the emotional and the interest sort of at a reasonable level throughout the trial. And that's certainly a consideration. So today's witness was Dr. Eric Christensen, who was the medical examiner who performed Tammy Daybell's autopsy. Now, there were some things that were a little bit different about this in the way it was presented, because at Lori Vallow Daybell's trial, those images were projected on the screen in the courtroom. Now, remember, Lori's trial was not live streamed, and so those images, the people who were able to see those images were limited to the people who were in the courtroom and in the overflow room downstairs in the courthouse. There weren't any video recordings of those, and only audio recordings of the trial proceedings went out after the close of court on that day. So the only people who really have seen these exhibits are members of the jury and people who happen to be in the courtroom on those trial days in Lori Vallow's trial. The court has opted not to show those images on the live stream, which I think is wise. I don't think any family should run the risk of having those images out in the ether, out on the internet. And so I agree wholeheartedly. I think it made it a little harder for the court watchers to understand what was going on. Although for those of us who had seen the testimony, Dr. Christensen's testimony in the Vallow case, they were a little bit easier to understand. So what Dr. Christensen said was, he was present when the body was exhumed. He then looked over the body. They go to the exhumation site because they want to know the condition of the grave. He made the point that he recently was involved in an exhumation of a body from the 1970s that they were hoping to exhume and obtain some DNA information. When they exhumed the body, the casket and the concrete enclosure had all suffered severe water damage, and they didn't believe that there was any way that they could get any reliable results. So that he explained that that's the reason why the medical examiner actually goes to the cemetery and is present when the body's exhumed. So Tammy's body was taken back to the medical examiner's lab, and he explained that they examined the body from head to toe. They examined the clothing to make sure that there's no indication in the clothing of what happened, and they do a full X-ray, and then they open the body and examine all of the internal organs. So he said that all of Tammy Daybell's internal organs were healthy. There was no indication of any heart disease. The only thing he found was that her lungs were slightly heavier than normal, probably because of the pulmonary edema. So when Tammy was discovered, she had a pink-tinged, blood-tinged foam that was coming out of her mouth and nose. That is a very classic indication of some sort of asphyxiation or other lung condition. Now, Dr. Christensen was quick to agree that asphyxiation is not the only cause of that pulmonary edema. But he said that her lungs were very clearly filled with fluid, and there was still very clear indication of the pink foam and the edema in her lungs. He said that suffocation is often sort of what you get to when you've ruled everything else out. So he ruled out any other disease mechanism that would have caused her death, and ruled out any, they did a very broad tox panel and ruled out any other source of poison or intoxicant. So now, do I know whether they tested for that particular toxin that our follower asked about, the TTX? I don't. And we may never know, we may never have those results, but it is possible that they might come available once Chad's trial's over, because at this point, the court has issued an order putting an embargo on the release of any of that information, whether it's sealed court documents or discovery materials, until after the trial. Because I promptly sent a FOIA, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one, once Lori Vallow's trial was over. So he said, so probably some of the most significant findings that Dr. Christensen testified about were the bruises on Tammy's body. On her right arm, and they put up a diagram, just a human body diagram to indicate. On her right arm, she had 4 bruises in her upper arm above her elbow, on both the front and the back of her arm, which could very well be a grabbing bruise. Okay. She had 1 bruise on her forearm and 1 bruise on her chest above her left, I think, breast. And on her right arm, she had 1 bruise, no, left arm. She had 1 bruise between her elbow and her shoulder. So the doctor then explained that the only real way to tell the age of a bruise. Now, I want to go back to Brenda Dye, because when Brenda Dye showed up, she noted in her coroner's report that Tammy had some old bruises. John Pryor made way big conversation about that, about the fact that she had some sort of a cream that was for sore muscles and bruises, some sort of homeopathic remedy that he keeps harping on was for bruises. And he made a really big deal of the fact that Brenda Dye, who repeatedly said, I'm not a physician, I'm not a medical examiner, noted those bruises as old. So Dr. Christensen said the only real way to determine the age of a bruise is to dissect it. So that was where we got to a whole series of pictures that were shown to the jury but not projected to the gallery, having to do with the cross sections of those bruises. Dr. Christensen was absolutely categorically without any uncertainty testified that those bruises happened at or just before the time of Tammy's death. The reason he was able to say that is because bruises have a typical progression. The the capillaries burst, the blood suffuses the tissues, and then the body begins creating, begins sending cells there to kind of clean it up. And that's why bruises turn yellow, and you can tell an old bruise. Well, in this instance, the first thing that happens is the inflammation, and then the cells come to kind of clean up. And Judge Christensen just categorically said there was no inflammation. There certainly was no body reacting to a bruise, which tells me that this bruise occurred either shortly before Tammy's death or around the time of her death. He did note that bodies can bruise after the heart has stopped pumping, but that's in a fairly short window of time and in fairly specific kinds of instances and mechanisms. So he very confidently said that Tammy's cause of death was suffocation, was asphyxiation due to suffocation, and that her cause of death was, the manner of death was homicide. So then we moved on. We're almost done with this week's testimony. Then we moved on to Alice and Todd Gilbert. Now, the Gilberts were neighbors of Chad and Tammy's, and they had known Chad and Tammy for years since they moved to Rexburg in 2015. Additionally, Alice Gilbert was the Relief Society president for their ward, which is sort of like the highest ranking woman in the LDS ward. And so she was the Relief Society president, and Tammy was her first counselor, which is like her vice president, or, you know, her right-hand woman. So because of that, she saw Tammy at least twice a week. They had a meeting on Wednesday, they went to church on Sunday, and they often talked in between. She said Tammy was a very empathetic person, and most of the time when she saw Chad and Tammy, it was together at church. She didn't see Chad a lot outside of church. She noticed in 2019, she said Chad and Tammy had always had a pretty good relationship, but in 2019, she noticed there was a lot of distance between them, which is interesting because it was in June of 2019 that Charles Ballow sent his emails to Tammy about the relationship between Chad and Lori. So she noticed that there seemed to be a sense of distance between them. She found out about, she testified that she had never seen Tammy faint, never seen her shaky or acting like she was going to pass out or having any kind of a seizure, that she seemed completely healthy and active. She'd never seen her sick. So it was Emma who called Alice the morning of Tammy's death to tell her. And Emma and Alice said, "Oh, I have to call the bishop." And Chad Daybell got on the phone and said, "Don't tell the bishop. And don't tell the bishop for at least an hour. He said, don't tell anybody for at least an hour," and then told her not to tell the bishop. She did anyway because she felt that the bishop needed to know. And then she and her husband Todd went over to Chad's that morning at about 8:30. So at that point, probably police were just leaving and things were sort of dying down. Once again, he had a different story for what happened because he told Alice and Todd that that Tammy had vomited that night at midnight, and that the coroner had already been there and said that Tammy died of a pulmonary embolism at 2 a.m. Now, we know that's not true because Dr. Christensen did an autopsy and said there was no evidence of a pulmonary embolism. Okay, I want to make that clear because we do know that that Alex Cox died of a pulmonary embolism, and a lot of people have a lot of suspicion about the neighbor, Eldon Clausen, who also died of a pulmonary embolism. But Dr. Christensen was very clear that Tammy did not die of a pulmonary embolism. She died due to pulmonary edema, which causes the pink foam, and that was as the result of asphyxiation. So, yet again, he told a different story. She attended the funeral. She and her husband attended the funeral in Springville because she said, I needed to see Tammy and to understand that this was real because she was my good friend. It was she who said she was surprised Chad wasn't more broken up. His talk was more a church talk than more like a sermon and less like a tribute to his loving wife. And shortly after that, a few days after that, they took a meal over to Chad, and Chad said, I can't stay in my house. I'm moving into a friend's condo. He gave the impression that the friend was a male who traveled a lot for business and wasn't home in his condo a lot. She and Todd called to check in on Chad on the 26th of October. Now, Tammy died on the 19th, so this is 7 days later. They asked if they could drop by and visit, and Chad said no, he would come to them. So he went to their house. He told them he had met the woman that he was going to marry. They were shocked. They asked him about it. He said he'd met her at a conference in 2018. And he said that her name was Lori Vallow and that she was a friend of Melanie Gibbs and had been on Melanie Gibbs' podcasts. Alice and Todd knew about Melanie Gibb and had heard some of her podcasts. So they recognized Melanie Gibbs' name. Then the following Tuesday, so the Tuesday after the 26th, they were at the temple because they were volunteering, working at the temple. And they came out of a room and there was Chad along with Lori and Melanie Boudreau Pulowski, niece Melanie. Some people call her Melanice. Anyway, and he brought Lori Vallow over to them. Lori was at the temple with Chad, and he brought her over and introduced her to Alice and Todd. Just a few days later, he took Lori over to their house and introduced her again, and they chatted a little bit. Alice said it was embarrassing that they were so touchy-feely like a couple of teenagers, and it made them feel uncomfortable. And she said she was embarrassed. Lori told Alice that her husband had died of a heart attack the December before, and Chad told them that Lori had a daughter who had recently died. That's important because later Chad denied saying that, although both Todd and Alice said they heard Chad say that. Chad brought over, later, Chad brought over his phone and showed them wedding pictures after he and Lori got married. He told them that he was going to go to Hawaii and write a book. They weren't clear whether he was moving there permanently or not, but said that they were taking his kids to Disneyland for Thanksgiving and then they were moving to Hawaii. She learned about Lori's kids being missing after Chad and Lori were married, and it made the news, and Lori was arrested in Hawaii. She called Chad, and Chad said, yes, it was Lori's kids that were missing, but that it was all the result of a custody battle, and that it would all be cleared up soon. Emma told her that Chad and Lori had gotten married. This is the part that it just still stuns me. Chad Daybell went to Alice and Todd and asked them if he could live with them. They said no. And he also asked them if they would put up their home and their farm to secure Lori's bail, because nobody in the family would do it. And he had the nerve to go ask one of Tammy's closest friends when she died, if they would put up their house, risk their house to secure Lori's bail. When they found out that Lori's kids were missing, she asked Chad, how many daughters did Lori have? And he said, well, just the one. And she said, but you told me her daughter had died. And he said, no, I didn't tell you that. He denied it. She said, well, I can't believe this kid just disappeared. I mean, doesn't she want a life? I mean, she's a teenager. Doesn't she want to go to college and get a boyfriend and all of those things? And Chad's comment was, she didn't like people and she didn't like me, past tense, which I thought was pretty revealing. They also called Todd Gilbert, Alice's husband, and he pretty much just confirmed what Alice had said. He didn't have any real new information, but he did corroborate what she'd said. The final two witnesses were Janice Olson, who worked with Tammy and was in the exercise class and came and said she was healthy. And then Taylor Ballard was the last witness, and she was the health insurance broker in town. So she was involved for a couple of reasons. Her agency or her company managed the health insurance and life insurance and all of the insurance for the school district. So she knew that Tammy had increased her life insurance just before she died. And she also was involved because Chad reached out to her to ask her about health insurance for him and his children, who were under 26, because Tammy was the one who had the health insurance, and that ended when she died. He later asked about adding Lori Daybell at that point, to an insurance policy, and told her that Lori was incarcerated. She said, well, the county and the state will take care of her health care while she's incarcerated. Reach out to me when she gets out and you can add her to your policy. Being incarcerated sort of tolls the time. So even though it is an open season, it's a life event and she could activate. So that was the end of testimony for today. I still have a ton I would like to talk about on a couple of other cases, but I don't know if we're going to get through it tonight. We have 405 people in the live chat. Thank you so much for being with us tonight live. And thanks for everybody who catches us on the replay. I know that it's not a great time for some people, either because they work or because they're in other parts of the world where it's a different time of day. So thank you for catching us on the replay. Before we dive into questions, I do want to say this. Every week, we try and take as many questions as we can out of the chat. We have a lot of folks in chat. it's inevitable that we're going to miss some. So please put your questions in the comments section below if we miss you, and I will answer those questions. I do go through the chat, and I also look at your questions, usually a day or so after the live. So please do that. We have a lot of information in our show notes, a lot of interesting links and connections to other creators and other true crime stories. So be sure and take a look at our lengthy show notes. Don't forget that if you are interested in the True Crime Quilt Guild, we've been showing our house a lot, so I keep putting things away. I just got a couple of new crane squares for our origami crane quilt for Larry and Kay. The instructions for the square are in our show notes, and please consider making a quilt square. They should finish to 6 inches and have a black background. Otherwise, the sky is the limit. Use whatever print you want for the crane, whatever color you choose, and do it from the heart for Kay and Larry. Once we have all of the squares, we will put it together, and the wonderful TERRI Goyins has offered to quilt it for Kay and Larry, and she does beautiful work. So thank you for that, TERRI. And if anybody has a quilt they would like to have quilted, consider sending it to TERRI. She did a beautiful job on our quilt, our True Crime Quilt Guild quilt. So let's take some questions. If you have questions, please post them in the chat now. I'm going to grab a swig here. Patterator. You guys have some of the most interesting handles. I would like prayers for my son and daughter-in-law. Their 2-month-old preemie son, Easton, is still in the NICU with respiratory issues. Thanks so much. Please, please keep Patterator and her little preemie grandson, Easton, in your prayers. It's so important. I believe in the power of prayer. I rely on the power of prayer more than I can tell you. And so please keep them in your thoughts. If you are not a person who prays regularly, then you put good energy into the universe for little Easton. And let's get him home soon. I do want to point out that JJ Vallow was a preemie baby. He weighed 2.5 pounds at birth, and that little fighter grew up to be a little dynamo. So preemie babies they start out with a few deficits, but they catch up. So we're just going to keep our good thoughts headed your way. Rose M. Would Heather Daybell be able to testify for the prosecution if called upon, even though she's been subpoenaed by the defense? Certainly, the prosecution could subpoena her and could call her in their case in chief. So just some, trial basics. When a case starts in a criminal case, the prosecution starts first. They call all their witnesses. They ask the direct questions. So they ask the witnesses direct where the discussion is going to go, and then the defense cross-examines. Once they are done and they have called all their witnesses and rested, then the defense takes over for their case in chief. At that point, they can subpoena witnesses and call their own witnesses. Then the roles shift. The defendant then asks the questions on direct, and the prosecution cross-examines. And so it's just the balance shifts. The prosecution certainly could call Heather Daybell. They certainly will have the opportunity to cross-examine her. I doubt seriously they'll do much in the way of cross-examination. But any of the witnesses that the defense has subpoenaed could be subpoenaed by the prosecution. In fact, throughout the trial, when a witness is done testifying, what we've heard the judge ask John Pryor is, he asked both sides, can this witness be released? Now, the prosecution has said, we think there's a chance we may recall this person so they can't be released from their subpoena. And that means that they can't view any of the testimony in the case or talk to anybody who has testified. So they're under the same sequestration order as they were to begin with, until their subpoena they're released from their subpoena. So, but the process, in a lot of instances, John Pryor would say, I also have this witness under subpoena. In the instances where the prosecution said, no, judge, we're done with this witness, they don't need to remain under subpoena, we're not going to call them back. There were several instances where John Pryor said, Your Honor, I was able to get all the questions answered I needed answered in my cross-examination, and so I'm also releasing them from subpoena. I don't know why John Pryor has Heather under subpoena. I don't know whether it's just spitefulness or whether he's got something specific he wants to talk to her about. She did do a lengthy interview with Hidden True Crime, and it may very well be that he has questions about some of the things she said on that show. I don't know. But she could be called. I'm losing my voice, guys. Jennifer says, these two questions kind of go together, so let's have them. Lisa Lou, do we think that she believes her dad innocent? I think we're talking about Emma. Or do we think she just knows more? I go back and forth. I think you're talking about Emma. I honestly think, okay, and Tiff Knox's question, does Emma believe he's a prophet too? Because that would make her the daughter of a prophet, and she might like that in some way. Oh, I think undoubtedly she likes that. And I think it is very clear that she, from the testimony we heard this week, that she believes that her dad has some sort of supernatural power, supernatural being above the natural world. I think that it was clear when she is talking in an email and to, I think it's Mark, saying, Mom and I taught a 12-year-old Sunday school class and Canyon Scott's actions confirmed he's a 4.2 dark. That is very specific. That is Chad. Nobody else is teaching or ascribing those numbers to people as light and dark. That is totally Chad, which means that Emma bought in on it because that's Emma's email. So I do think that Emma believes that her father is a prophet. I do think that she is, of all of his children, the one who was most quickly and thoroughly drank the Kool-Aid, because she does believe. And I thought that was clear from her interview on whatever show that was. And I think it was 2020 actually that did that interview with the kids. I think it was very clear from that show that she's still hook, line, and sinker believes her dad. She believes that he had an emotional affair with Lori, but that's all, and that Lori Vallow deceived him, and that it all boils down to Lori and Alex framing her dad. I think that she still very much believes that. And I think she believes that he's a prophet, or believes at a minimum that he has some sort of extraordinary power, that he talks to people from beyond the veil, and that he is given that information from the beyond. So yeah, I don't know about the other kids, but I think it's very clear where she stands. And she certainly has become the matriarch of the family. She's really become the leader of the family in Chad's absence. And it was very clear from that interview that she was the spokesperson for the kids, and that she's their leader. So good question. Hi, Zero. I wanted the doctor to say there were at least 2 people involved in murdering Tammy. 2 held her arms and 2 held her feet. I don't know. John Pryor started sort of getting into that, like what would be the mechanics of if you put a pillow over her face, and the judge shut that off really quickly. It's very clear that she had bruises, whether it is because somebody knelt on her and held her down while they put a pillow over her face, or what the mechanism was is unclear. And the judge kind of cut off that speculation. The doctor really didn't go there in terms of, sort of expressing an opinion about the mechanism of death. So, John Pryor tried to get into it, and the judge kind of shut him down really quickly. Ladybug Lady, do you feel as an attorney we will get a guilty verdict? So how do you feel it's going? I think there's going to be a guilty verdict. I would be very surprised at this point. Now, we have not seen John Pryor's case in chief yet, so we haven't seen his defense. But what I can say about what we have seen so far in his cross of witnesses is sort of going along this theme of Chad was just a victim of the femme fatale, and that it was Lori and Alex that did all the nefarious things, and that he was framed and they planted the bodies in his yard. And I mean, it's very clear that's where they're going. They have such a strong circumstantial case. Yes, they do not know where the children were murdered. Yes, they do not know the precise mechanism of Tammy's death, but they don't have to. The jury instructions specifically will tell the jurors they don't have to identify a motive. They don't have to even identify the location where the children were killed or a mechanism of death. If they can connect enough pieces together to make that circumstantial chain, then it doesn't matter that a link like that is missing. So I do think that we're going to get a guilty verdict. I think this is a very thoughtful jury, but I don't think they're indecisive. I don't get the impression when I look at them that they're indecisive. Now, it only takes one to hang the jury, but I don't at this point in the trial see anything that I could foresee being an issue that would hang the jury, that would hang them up enough that there'd be a person who'd say, I can't vote guilty. Now, like I say, we haven't seen Chad's defense yet. So is it possible that they could raise something that there will be at least one person who would say, I can't vote guilty because of this fact? Possible. I have been trying in my what little free time I've been able to eke out to follow the Karen Read trial. And I will say 2 things about the Karen Read trial from the portions of it that I've watched. First of all, if you want to see a masterful trial attorney, her defense is killing it. So if you want to see really good lawyering, that's a trial to watch. The other thing I will say is that there's enough reasonable doubt in that case already to drive a truck through. So I think that if you're watching a little of both, you get the opportunity to contrast the two. And I think that if you take a look at both of those, you can really see the difference in a stronger circumstantial case versus a weaker circumstantial case. So they are really tearing it up, and it's impressive. So I would definitely catch them if you can. If you're really interested in trial technique, because I think her defense attorneys have been really good. They've done a few little things that are just gold. I mean, they had a police officer on the stand on Friday, and or actually, I guess yesterday, and he was back on the stand this morning. And the first thing the defense attorney said was, "Now, officer, you testified yesterday," and the defense attorney started his cross this morning, so the guy had finished his direct. And so the defense attorney stood up and said, "Now, officer, you testified yesterday. Before we get started, is there anything that you would like to change or would like to correct in the testimony you gave yesterday?" And that's a fantastic technique, because the officer says, "No, no, I'm good." And then you proceed to just punch holes in their investigation and take them to task. And that's exactly what the defense attorney did. And it was really masterful. So it's very clear her lawyers are prepared. They are ready to rock and roll. The last thing I wanted to bring up, because we're over our 2-hour mark, is that Judge Gull in the Delphi case today issued an order saying that there was insufficient evidence to hold Richard Allen's attorneys in contempt. So all of we lawyers who said about that, the state bringing a contempt action, all of us, we lawyers who said that's BS, were totally vindicated. Now, if you are interested in the Delphi case, there are 2 cases going on right now, which I think have a chance that we're going to see acquittals in. One of them is Reed, and the other one is Delphi. If you have an interest in either one of those cases, Bob Motta from Defense Diaries and Jay from The Shaming of Jay, which is a fairly new true crime channel, have been doing joint coverage of the Karen Reed trial. And Bob Motta and Allie, his wife, have been, and I always want to say Bob and Allie because everybody talks about it being Bob's show, but Allie's the other lawyer in the family, and she's very insightful. They have been covering Delphi for a long time. So the link to their channel, Defense Diaries, is in our show notes, and I highly recommend them if you are interested in either one of those 2 cases. I am going to try and continue to keep up on Karen Reed, but my publisher just reached out to me and said, "We're getting ready to typeset the book, and I need any of the additions that are going to come in on Chad's trial the best you can." And so I'm kind of scurrying right now, trying to figure out how that's going to fit in. So I haven't had as much time. Yes, Francis C. Gull is, if you can believe that, the judge in Delphi. So we have Judge in the Koberger case, and we have Francis C. Gull in the Delphi case. Hi, Don. I had to pause and am way behind. Sorry if my timing is wrong. Question, will the book be available on Audible? Keep checking, but I can't pre-order there yet. The book will be available on audio, but generally books do not release on audio until the release date when they go on the shelf. So I've never seen a book available for pre-order on Audible, but on September 3rd, when it hits the shelf, it should hit on Audible as well. Generally what happens is that the publisher decides on a narrator, and as soon as the book is in its finished form, in its PDF form, which everybody who's part of the Book Lunch League will get a copy of, and that's the finished form that's being typeset, then the publisher goes out and begins the process of having the audiobook recorded. So they haven't discussed with me recording it. I'm not opposed to it, but it's not high on my list of things I want to do. So usually they get a professional, somebody who routinely does audiobooks and is much better at it and more fluent when they read, and has the setup for it. They have like a teleprompter reader and all the right microphones, and so. But I expect it's part of my contract that the book will come out in audio, and so I expect. Even my divorce book came out in audio, so I expect that once we have the final version that's going to be typeset, we will also have the book being recorded, and it should be available when they hit the shelves. And I'm with you. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I find it easier, y'all know, from my silly courtroom doodles, that I'm a little on the ADD side, and that it helps me concentrate when I have something, my hands are doing something. So oftentimes I listen to books while I'm working around the house, or I'm quilting, or I'm doing something else, because that's the best way for me to absorb that information. So, and after, I guess, maybe just a little bit lazy, since after years of legal reading, it's easy. So we're 10 minutes over time. I want to say thank you so much for everybody that joined us tonight. I appreciate you more than you know. Thank you for the couple super chats. I always appreciate a little support. Every once in a while, I get a little note that somebody bought me a coffee, which is always great too. Thank you. And I'm going to wish you a great week. I will promise that this weekend, I didn't feel like there were huge developments in the case that warranted a surprise live, but I will promise that if things develop throughout the week, you could see a surprise live on Saturday. So all the more reason for you to subscribe and hit that bell notification. So I want to say thanks to Jen, who is our moderator par excellence and who always does a wonderful job. And with that, I'm going to say goodnight. Thanks again.